Ollie, thank you so much for joining us this evening. One of the things we've seen with the pandemic is obviously changing how we work, the whole concept of working from home. But I want to talk to you and start this conversation with if you're seeing the change in what we value as work. This pandemic has caused a big shift in perhaps thinking and introspecting about what work looks like and what the meaningfulness of work looks like. Have you kind of seen any shift in the regard of us perhaps societally changing what we value as meaningful work?
Well, let's start with what we've seen, right? What we've noticed, for instance, I saw a survey the other day that indicated, it asked the question, do you think the length of the workday has increased or decreased because of work from home? And it turns out it's increased. People are working more. And you know this when you talk to people who worked from home before the pandemic, right? That one of the biggest problems with working from home was the boundaries, the decision about what work time is and what family time is and what lunchtime is and breakfast is, and all that's kind of become a little complicated. And for those of us who are used to structures, including me, because I do a TV show, right? So I would go into a studio by a certain time, and I'd be in makeup in a certain time, and I'd be in meetings at a certain time. So when you lose all of that structure, that becomes problematic because so many of us identify with the structure of our work. Now it's lunch, now it's time for a meeting, now it's time for work-related social events. And that all becomes very complicated. And then it gets tied into your value because it used to be that work and home were two different places. Now in a perfect world, you got a great deal of value from being at home among your family and your loved ones, and you got a great deal of value from being at work where you felt valued and professional. Now when it all comes together, they're often not in balance, right? So what do you like more? Do you like work or do you like home? And what happens when they're both together? It's very rare that a person gets everything they want out of home life and everything that they want out of work life. But now that it's together, it has caused a lot of people to examine whether it suits them properly. Now, I would say that there's some proportion of people for whom, Zane, this is fantastic. Right? Working from home eliminates a 1 or 2 hour commute in each direction from work, and it saves you on gas and saves you on lunch money, and you're spending time with your family if you like your family. And for some people, this is throwing them into some sort of existential angst about, is this really what I wanted to do? My life was about being out. My life was about performing. My life was about being in a court or being on a theater stage or whatever, or in a hospital. As I've said before, I think this is a great time to reevaluate what you're doing and whether you really like it, because we're going to be stuck with some version of this for a time. In other words, even if we get a virus or a vaccine or a cure to coronavirus, there are a lot of companies who are going to decide this is actually more efficient for us. The cost saving is good. There are a lot of workers who are going to say, I actually want to stay working from home. So why not take this moment to reevaluate whether this is working for you, and if not, how you can fix it to make it work for you.
You brought up a point that I think is fascinating, which is this concept of identity and work. People's identity rooted to the jobs and the careers that they've had. Do you see any shift in that the pandemic has caused as we've been juggling everything from, teaching our kids to trying to get enough recreation and exercise to enjoying vacation? What is that anymore? Have you kind of seen identity as a construct of being singularly associated with work perhaps changing, whereas, it's been a real push towards productivity in the past? Are we seeing anything new, or could we be seeing a new identity matrix with what work looks like going forward?
Well, I had one colleague, for instance, tell me this morning, I wish I could just go to work for a couple of days a week, go into work. We're very efficiently, in fact, this particular person's job is as well done from home as not, and generally speaking, she appreciates it. But she was missing something about going to a place called work. And being around people who you know as workers, number one. Number two, there are a lot of things that we are realizing about the value of our work or other people's. Any parent of any child, particularly a young child, who was home with their child, understands the value of teachers in a way that they have never before, right? So all of a sudden, you're not going to think about all these teachers complaining about how they don't get paid enough. Now that becomes very real for you. You are also very conscious, if you're working from home, about all the people who don't have a choice about working from home, all the service providers that still come to your house, the delivery people who still come to your house. So I almost think we're developing a sense of other people's identities and respect for the work that others do. But as for yourself, I think it's important to understand there's a healthiness about having a strong identity linked to your work. But I found this after being at CNN for many years. I was there for 12 or 13 years. And when I left, I thought to myself, wow, for a very large portion of my working life, I only knew myself as a CNN reporter and anchor. What happens when that ends? And it's not unhealthy, or it's not healthy for you to not be able to separate yourself from the trappings of what you call work. It's a good, healthy exercise to be able to say, I can be productive and I can still be what I describe myself as being from home. And I think in a tricky economy in which jobs are being lost and unemployment is higher than it normally is, I think one should always be able to say, I am who I am, irrespective of my job or my job title or the office I have or the company for which I work. And I think that is probably the better part of the growth here, to say, I'm more me now than I ever was. I'm in my home more. I'm with my family more. I don't put on a facade to go to leave work and go out to work in the same way that I did before. So who am I, and what do I want to make this life more fulfilling? So I think I think of this as far more opportunity than disadvantage. Notwithstanding, there are actually people who cannot work from home. There are people who are still not able to make ends meet. There are people who are still getting laid off. So I don't want to paint this as some sort of panacea. I'm saying if you have the privilege of continuing to work, but are working from home or mostly from home, use that to your advantage.
I think that's such an interesting point there, Ellie, because, as much as work has been about productivity, there's been almost for certain classes of people, a performative aspect to work, right? The external broadcasting that you're working, that you're being productive, that you're adding societal value. And so let's talk about that in the context of this catch-all term, this concept of the future of work. And, prior to this pandemic, we would have probably classified the future of work perhaps singularly rooted in the automation and the future of technology. Right. We've kind of now had perhaps a little bit more texture added to that. So from your perspective, what would you classify the future of work as being almost in a post-pandemic or in a pandemic reality? What is the future of work being to you?
So this is a really good point that you bring up, because I've done a lot of studying and going to conferences about the future of work, and almost exclusively it's about robotics and automation and AI, things like that. It's about the ways in which repetitive aspects of your job will be taken over by the machine. That's actually not going to change. That's still going to happen. But now we are, for the first time in 30, 40, 50 years, actually rethinking what work looks like. So what we've had over the last 15 years or so is this sense of, wow, we can really grind people down. We can be abusive in our work environments. People can work too many hours. And we're not just talking about blue-collar work, we're talking about white-collar work. Interns who, work until midnight every night and come in at 7 o'clock the next morning. Now we are realizing that the shift here is in productivity, not based on rules that you establish to gain that productivity, right? So when somebody comes into your office, you have them for 8 hours. So you can dictate how they behave. There are a lot of Wall Street firms, for instance, or Bloomberg, where they give you free food. They will cater at your every meal, and there'll be you walk out to a common area and there's nothing but food. The design is so that you don't leave the building. Right? You stay here and work as much as you can, take food back to your desk. You get free food at Goldman Sachs, but you got to eat it at your desk. So now we're realizing you can't control how people eat. You can't control when they eat. You don't really know all these things about them. You just need them to be productive. And maybe what we're learning is that different people have different ways of being productive. That sometimes it's not about controlling where they eat and how they eat and what time they start and what time they end. Lo and behold, working from home has resulted in longer work hours and greater productivity without having to house people in your high-paid rental office buildings. So I think everybody's rethinking this whole thing, that what value can you provide to your workers to allow them to be as productive as you'd like them to be. And I think this is a natural outcropping of a world in which we started thinking about how do we make it better for workers? How do we actually make them more comfortable about their work environments? And I think the net gain is generally there. There is a net loss in socialization. There's a net loss, for instance, with people who have a difficult family life or a troubled marriage or tensions at home. Work was the 8 to 10 to 12 hour a day escape from that. Work was some normalcy. Work for some people was the only exercise they got. Work was being out there in our global village on the subway or in the car or in the parking lot and seeing people. Work was going out and trying different foods for lunch. So we have to make sure that in our work from home world, we don't become isolated and weird. But generally speaking, you can set up your home office the way you want it to be. You need very little. We have a phone here and a lamp that exists. I haven't haven't purchased anything new to work from home, and yet I'm doing it effectively. So these are the things we have to think about. What are going to be the benefits of this, and how do you deal with the things that are not beneficial to you? We have seen some instances of increases in depression, in suicidal thoughts, in family tensions, in spousal abuse. So we have to remember, how do you get connected to the world? Remember, if you were having any of these problems, sometimes your workplace caught it. Sometimes you had a counselor, or you had friends at the workplace, or policies where your manager would check in on you and caught it. And you would do the same thing if you were a business owner or a business manager. So we're going to have to study how work from home becomes as beneficial and as fruitful. But the early indications are, for those who are able to work from home, it's actually potentially more fruitful and more productive than the work we've been in.
You know, I want to get into the conversation about robotics and automation in a second here, but you brought up something that I think we should go down that rabbit hole for a second, which is this concept of perhaps workers in this strange way in this post-pandemic world now having the ability to kind of shape their lives around work, almost this harmonization of work into their lives. If I ask you to kind of put your prognostication hat on, do you feel like that is going to be one of the most prevalent upsides or opportunities of this situation, where workers will have the ability to kind of mold what work looks like for them and right-size it to their life?
Yeah, we were going that way, right? With the gig economy and with millennials and Gen Z who didn't really subscribe to this whole 1950s-esque office-style work with a weird hierarchy that didn't make sense to them. Some of my youngest colleagues are sort of wondering how we all came around to these structures where you come in at this level, even if, they're smarter than we all are and they did better in school. So this breaks down some hierarchy. It gives you some sense of control. You can now work for a really traditional, old-fashioned company and feel like you're a gig worker, which if you're 20, 25, 30, it's kind of cool, right? That's kind of the way you worked. You had your laptop and you worked from wherever you were. So the working world has now moved toward what a lot of the young people, who account for a third of our society, really our working economy, think that work should be like. There are a lot of young people for whom this is not a weird adjustment. This is how they saw life going. It's a natural extension in some cases from school or from university into the work life. So I actually think that the pandemic has forced us to deal with what the newest and youngest and sometimes best performing of us already thought was a better way to work. There were all sorts of reasons why companies didn't go to work from home. We've struggled with it for 10 years. Tech companies said work from home, then they said we're not working from home. Look at the opportunities that are open to people who can't afford to live close to work in high-rent cities, or for couples who have jobs in different cities, or for young people who have an aged parent who they want to take care of, or for mothers with children. In societies where we don't, certainly in America, we don't deal with childcare as well as they do in Canada. So for all of these groups, working from home is a remarkable advantage. It's a remarkable gain. Again, we always have to keep in mind, generally speaking, for the least among us and the lowest wage earners, service jobs, which are prevalent in our society, do not allow for this. But for those that do, this is a big gain. There's a job that a woman with a small child couldn't have taken that now she can take or do because of work from home.
Let's talk a little bit more about the future of work as it relates to kind of automation, service sector jobs. I don't want to get into a mindset of necessarily fear, but what should we be looking out for? If I'm sitting in the Jamaat right now and I'm seeing this concept of future of work being floated to me in banner headlines, what should I be actually concerned about, and what should I be looking out for in terms of, what could perhaps replace my gig, or what should, my kids be aware of as they perhaps go down the path of pursuing education in one of the quote unquote traditional fields that we've pursued in the past?
So I think there are several steps you have to take. And the first one is reality. You have to say, can my job be automated? And I've heard most people get that answer wrong. So I'll ask myself, can my job be automated? 100%. Can it be outsourced? Absolutely. A company can say, we like you, but we think it'd be easier if you lived in a not as high cost of living place as New York. So we're going to reposition you to, make it up, Bangladesh or something. Or we're going to find somebody who can do the news from there. Or we're going to get AI that's going to go through everything I've ever said on TV and learn exactly how I would say anything. So somebody can write a news script, actually a computer could do it, and some avatar that looks like me can read it, or some live anchor that looks like me across the world can read it for 1/5 the salary. So don't kid yourself into what can't be done. There are very few things that cannot be replicated and automated, right? And they are, generally speaking, services. If you have to call someone to come to your house, that may not be replicated. But a lot of the people who come to your house are delivery people. That too can be replicated. So first, just be really honest and Google it and look it up. Has anyone tried to automate your job? Because if it can be automated, understand that it will be automated. Number two, how much can you delay that? To what extent can I say, okay, the news business is being automated. How long can I push this for? Now, if I'm 50, which I happen to be, I can possibly push this for another 15 years or 20. Maybe I'll be ready to retire then. But if I'm 40 and I have a lot of work years ahead of me and my job's likely to be automated within the next 10 years, I should start thinking about that. I shouldn't be surprised by it when it happens in 10 years. Number three, what can you learn that allows you to benefit from that automation? So is there some degree of coding or automation that I can engage in that's going to set me up for the journey between where we are now and full automation? And you'll find that in Germany, factory workers do this, right? They train their factory workers into people who can manage the robotics that then take their jobs. Now, it's not fantastic to train for the interim period between you having a job and you losing a job, but it's better than just losing the job. Number four, think about your kids. It is ridiculous to think that you might be denying reality about the automation of your job, but your child, who's going to have, 60 working years in front of them, probably the way things go these days, guide them properly. It is in the interest of universities and places like that to continue to train people for things that they might not be employable in. It is not in the interest of any parent to see that happen. So again, there are great jobs that will exist for a long time. I certainly don't want to scare people into thinking all jobs are going to disappear. And frankly, we will make this shift into a different economy, and we will still be able to employ people at the other end of it. But if you are talking about your kids, there's zero reason not to have the conversation with them to say, have you looked into the degree and rate at which the profession you are choosing to go into can be automated? And the role that AI will play. For some people, it may not change. If you're a doctor or you're a surgeon, there's still going to be surgery. It's going to be robotics assisted surgery. And some of your training can be assisted by robotics. You can still be a surgeon, but don't put blinders on about the fact that we can automate almost everything. The machine and the human brain are going to come together in a way that a lot of people are not foreseeing. And I think we have to be very honest with ourselves about that.
Those are some very insightful comments, Ollie. And as much as I love you, I'm not sure if I want to see a robotic version of you one day. We may just have to deal with it. But, I want to move on to a topic that's just adjacent to this, which is when we talk about, the steps that you'd mentioned, this concept of future-proofing, right? Another buzzword that comes out. Is there a more or less defensive posture, I should say, than future-proofing? And what do you see as the upside, right? If today, I'm grinding it out as a worker, I look at the fact that my job could be automated. What's the upside there for me? We talk about retooling or reskilling. How does one kind of engage in that process in perhaps a little bit more bite-sized format? Because it's quite a daunting reality when you come to the realization that whether it's a decade or a generation from now, that the work that you've been used to do or the work that you currently do is perhaps on the docket.
So I think there's a couple of things here. One is that it would help to become familiar with the language of what's happening, right? So to the extent that our kids use drones, it's not weird for them that, drones are going to deliver our packages. To the extent that we use artificial intelligence in our daily lives, we become familiar with it, whether it's home automation or the devices we use, you start to become familiar with it, and the future doesn't feel like as much of a threat to you, right? Number one, be familiar with it. Number two, it's kind of exciting. Once we get to the other side of it, it'll be really exciting. It's the transitions that are always hard. It was the same thing during the Industrial Revolution. The transition is always difficult, but the other side's exciting. So the more you can excite yourself about it by reading about it, by watching it, by talking to people, by listening to TED Talks, you can imagine that there is a world on the other side of this that's going to be really neat for your kids and to some degree for you. But it's the it. If you don't know what the it is, if you just see this as some future coming towards you whose main objective is to steal your job, that's where the problem comes in. By the way, it's exactly the same problem with immigration. It's the same problem with all the social issues we have, right? People look at immigration as they're coming to take my job, as opposed to, wow, we're going to actually build the population up to the rate that we need in order to be a productive society and have people working so I can retire because they can pay into the systems that I'll benefit from and get a diverse workforce. No, immigrants steal jobs and bring crime. That's the same way you have to think about artificial intelligence and robotics. They're not just here to steal jobs. They're here to make your life simpler and less expensive in the long run. Where do you fit into the whole spectrum? That's the issue. Where many of us live at a time of change is at one end of the spectrum, and then this stuff happens to us. Don't be a victim of it. Know that it's coming and know how to ride that wave. There may be great ways to ride that wave. There may be bits of continuing education you can do. There may be real full retooling that you can do. But future proofing is something you can, generally speaking, do. Where you have a problem is when you're geographically bound to a place that is going to be hit heavily by the future. So this is what we saw in manufacturing areas in Canada and the United States. In Canada, they tend to be more diverse. Manufacturing areas are adjacent to well-diversified places. In the United States, there's city after city after city in towns where there's steel mills or coal plants or car manufacturing. So it got decimated. The modern equivalent of that is oil places. So if you're in Calgary or you're in Houston, you do have to think about the fact that as the world turns, what will happen to you? And you have to make sure that you're well diversified. Maybe everybody in your family shouldn't be there, or maybe everybody in your family shouldn't be in the same profession or tied to the same industry. That's the larger part about future proofing. But it's the future. It's going to come to us, and lots of great things are going to come with it, including better health and better health care. So it's not all bad.
You know, as much as members of our Jamaat might be on the standpoint of being workers in our economy, you know, having some of this come to them, wanting to understand how they may grapple with it, we're also kind of fortunate as a community to have many people who are perhaps going to be shaping what the future of work looks like, whether that's, you know, being executives at large office towers or whether it's in the confines of their small business. So, you know, as we are perhaps shaping the future of work, perhaps taking what we see and incorporating it in our own businesses or in the processes that we have control of, how would you apply kind of an equity lens, Ali? Because I know this has been something you've talked about quite a bit, which is we talk about, you know, society really being the definition of what we do for our most vulnerable, not for those at the top. How do we ensure that we apply that equity lens as it relates to this future of work concept going forward?
So this is a really important one because it's so weird. When we see these futuristic things, they come up as companies and they get onto the stock market. We value them at the highest levels, right? We value technology really well in society, but we don't talk about the dirty little secrets of automation and robotics. And the reason I think that's important is because right now we don't talk about the least among us anyway. So what the pandemic has done is it has shown us that I can work from home. But there are a lot of people who can't work from home. They don't have jobs that allow that. They have kept working. And some of those people live in multi-generational homes without the ability to be in a 6,000-foot multi-generational home. It might be a 3-bedroom apartment, in which case things like COVID can spread more quickly. Or they have underlying health conditions, which happens when your life is associated with poverty. This COVID has laid bare the degree to which, you know, everybody says the virus knows no borders and it knows no this and it knows no that. You know what it knows? It knows the difference between prosperity and poverty. And if you're poor, it hits you. And so the lesson from this thing is everything hits you harder if you're poor. Every flu hits you harder. Every hurricane hits you harder. Every recession hits you harder. And if you go into these things in good financial shape, you come out running. If you go into them stumbling economically, it can flatten you out and take a long time to recover from. And that's not your fault. That's society's fault. So as we are looking at another major change to the way we work, which is it's big, it's as big or bigger than the Industrial Revolution, the way automation and AI and robotics will change our world. As we look at that, understand that it's nobody's fault that it's happening. What do we do to make this a more equitable society? And there are lots of really good solutions around that. They involve, generally speaking, strengthening the social safety net, which may not be your job from day to day, but do remember it when you're casting a ballot. that there are some people who think it's every man for himself. We're not here to do it. Here in the United States, we're talking about the extension of the CARES Act to the HEROES Act, we're calling it, to subsidize people who are having a rough time. And there are 20 U.S. senators who've said enough is enough. It's not our job to do this. No, it is your job to do it. Through no fault of their own. There are a whole lot of people who are about to lose their apartments or their homes and their unemployment benefits. It is actually our job to fix this. So this lens has got to be central. If you are building, and the beauty we have in our community is that we still have the immigrant experience. Like a lot of people who are watching this will be immigrants. A lot of people, their parents are immigrants. We may even have some people watching this whose grandparents were immigrants, but their parents were born here. But we still have the immigrant ethos. The immigrant ethos is the ethos of flexibility and the ethos of fairness, right? Apply that to what you do. You have the ability to be flexible, so we can learn, we can bob and weave around these new trends, but we do have to be fair. We have much to give these countries that have been kind to us, and what we can give back is to make them better and fairer and kinder. Now we're doing that because there are people who find themselves in great positions in governance, in politics, in corporations, and in medicine, in law. They're doing that. But that is the thing we have to keep in front of us. What this virus has done is shown us that our societies that we think are fair are fundamentally unfair in a way we didn't even recognize. It lets viruses kill the least among us. We need to change that.
Ollie, you brought this up, which is the policy instrumentation. I'd be remiss to not ask you, now that I have you here with this discussion, do you fear that this conversation of future of work, perhaps in both of our countries, might become politicized? We're seeing the increased tribalization of certain things. Even mask wearing has become a political issue in both of our countries. Do you feel like the future of work and the meaningfulness of that, especially through that equity lens we're just talking about, has potentially the ability to become politicized in our countries?
Sure, it will. Look, work changes always get politicized because there's such an opportunity to go to people who are working in the fields that are going to change and warn them that this is going to be really bad. So if you elect me, I will hold that off. I will do everything I can to make sure your industry does not become computerized or automated, and that AI doesn't come in so that you can keep your job. And so it's very easy to do that. Then you can attach, in the United States, it's become very popular to blame all technological advances on China, right? China's trying to take control and kind of do that. I don't know what's true or not, but the point is China's engaging in a lot of technological advances. So you can start to make technology the enemy. That's as stupid as making immigrants the enemy, right? It is what it is. We benefit, we live longer, we will get a vaccine to this virus and a cure to it because of technology. We also need technology to stop this earth from warming, which we haven't quite mastered yet as well. Technology is going to solve most of our problems, but it brings with it ethical questions. And that it brings with it ethical questions doesn't mean you throw it out. It means you actually have to address the ethical questions. We have to hold debates. We should have another conversation just about the ethics of automation and robotics, because some people think it's an amazing thing. Other people only see their job going away. What if we actually created a society where we can say we can have the benefits of robotics and automation and AI, and we can protect you? Maybe it means a minimum basic income or a universal basic income, ideas that have been floated that we don't really think about because it sounds like welfare. It sounds like giving people money to stay home. But there are real reasons why we should think about these things as a community. And by the way, Canada is going to be much more successful in having this discussion because you've already got a stronger safety net than we do in the United States. In the United States, when people hear universal basic income, they freak out. They think we're giving people money. Right now, the conversation is we're paying more people to stay home than if they worked. We're paying them, more money to stay home. There's something wrong with your wages if people get more money on unemployment than they do working. That's a societal problem. That's not actually a problem. Most people want to work. The general instinct for humanity is to work. So what do you do when you might go into a place where there are more jobs than people on an ongoing basis because of automation and robotics? Well, you find out how those people can be most productive. Maybe I'm meant to be a poet, but it doesn't pay much money, in case you've ever tried being a poet. So does the universal basic income create better art, better poetry, better people who sit around and think about things? There's all sorts of discussions that should be had, but you have to be in those discussions. You have to read the books, and you have to try and get access to those TED Talks and those things that discuss these difficult issues. Our politics lends itself to easy answers and being dismissive. Let's not do that. This is a moment in our time, an opportunity to think about the future of work. Let's grab it and understand it and be part of the discussion. Have a seat at the table.
I love that example of perhaps a universal basic income oxygenating creativity, putting a different texture to our economy, creating more value in different ways that we haven't seen before, or that people haven't pursued before because of purely economic or financial reasons. And that kind of ties into this last theme I want to talk about, Ellie, which is around education. We sit here in August right now, and both of our countries are grappling with what the school year, especially for higher ed, looks like in September. What do you kind of see as the value of a degree, and what do you kind of see as the value of education going forward, and perhaps even how education is delivered going forward? I know we're in this debate of value between post-secondary education tuition just spiking through the roof, especially in the United States, but give me some of your thoughts on the value of post-secondary education, especially layered on with the delivery mechanisms we're now potentially going to be seeing.
Tuition in some American universities is upward of $50,000 a year. So that's a good question, right? Can I become one of these things and pay less? I'm a professor at Wharton, and all our classes in fall are going to be online. And by the way, I happen to be teaching a course that we can probably fairly effectively do online, but I didn't learn how to teach online. I didn't even do this, right? We didn't have Zoom meetings and things like this. Now I'm learning, but do my students deserve better than somebody who's just figuring this out now? I think they do. And we have to think about this because these are Wharton students, top of their game, paying top dollar to get this education in part from me. And we have to learn how to be excellent at this. And we are figuring out, first of all, just to keep people safe, but we're figuring out what things can students learn that can be done effectively online. And I'm actually quite confident that the course I can teach can be done online. But what are we doing about nurses and doctors and engineers? Obviously, some of it can be done online, but we haven't figured this out. It's a really, really crucial discussion to have because this is one of those things like work from home that once we make the switch, consider the accessibility that we will achieve when we've switched over to effective online learning at major universities. We had these MOOCs and things like that, courses that people could take, but it tended to not be for people who were pursuing something professionally. There were very specialized places where you could study online. What if, from an economic perspective, everything is open to everybody? So Wharton actually takes not just the best students who can apply to Wharton, but the best students anywhere because it's online. That opens it up for universities around the world. It opens it up for students around the world who might be living somewhere else in the world, would really like to go to Wharton, but they can't get their papers because it's hard to get into America, and they can't afford it, and culturally it's too much of a shift. This is remarkable. So I think it's going to be a big question from a financial point of view. Those universities that offer a good education, who, by the way, don't charge $50,000 a year, are going to see a big boon. For those that do charge a lot, student aid is going to become a lot more important. And there are a lot of students who don't need the student aid, but they wonder to themselves, if I'm not living on campus and doing the things that I associate with university, what's it worth to me? So I think all of that is becoming a really important conversation. But in the end, like work from home, I think the gains are greater than the losses. We're going to end up in a world in which we're going to get more value for our dollar in terms of education, create greater accessibility. And I think when we look back at this in 10 years, we will have said the pandemic has done one interesting thing, and it broke down some barriers to education.
When we talk about education, the other aspect is what you study. And I think this future of work conversation, even prior to the pandemic, was really about, certain things are now becoming commodified. You don't necessarily want to get these technical skills if a robot is able to do it one day, perhaps even in the next decade. So focus on creativity, focus on the A in STEAM, focus on the critical thinking skills. How would you right now, kind of looking at the current terrain, reconcile the schools of thought regarding, perhaps fine arts, liberal arts on one hand, all the way to technical knowledge on the other? Is there perhaps a shift in what we're seeing?
So I'm a liberal arts graduate from Queens. I talk about it all the time. I think liberal arts creates remarkable critical thinking. On the other hand, when I wrote a book in 2010 about what you should study, my co-author and I, Christine Romans from CNN, and I chose accounting and engineering. The opposite, right? And now I would say that in a world which can be automated, only the engineers are safe. Even the accountants are not safe because it's in many cases repetitive tasks as opposed to creative work. So the liberal arts side of the brain can't easily be replicated by computers yet, but there isn't as much work for the liberal arts side of the brain right now. So it's a really interesting conundrum. Do you really want everybody just going into jobs that can't be replicated? So to my mind, architecture comes to mind, right? An architect has skills that can be replicated by a computer, but you're not ever, generally speaking, paying the architect for their technical skills, their drafting skills, and you got the architect for their brain. The engineer, the computer does the work, but the engineer designs the work that the computer does. So I think we have to have second and third level conversations about this. I think there are some liberal arts educations that people get at liberal arts universities that we have to seriously look at to say, where are you going with this degree? Where can it lead in terms of critical thinking? And is the critical thinking going to actually get you a job in which you can critically think? And in my opinion, there are some things in the liberal arts that should probably be de-emphasized at the moment. At the same time, I don't think we want to be graduating an entire class of robot programmers, right? So there's really good work for robot programmers and engineers, and I still believe that the future is about engineering. But I think everybody and every family has to think about this as a portfolio. If you got 3 kids, and kids don't want to be told what to do because you're a piece of a portfolio, but should families be thinking about the fact that, all right, if you're going to be a this, then maybe you should be a this? And these are tough questions because every kid wants to do what every kid wants to do, but they do need guidance, because what I don't think high schools are necessarily in a position to tell students graduating is that you want to study this, but it's not going to get you a job anytime soon. This is it's a vibrant and important discussion to have that I don't have the answers to, but I would think about it better than I did when I was graduating high school or university.
You know, you brought up this concept of humanities, right? Like those who have studied in that space. And we have a lot of people in that space who've studied their humanities or have gone down law or other elements of more of that space. And you mentioned there's less work for them right now in that sense. What does kind of future-proofing for them look like? So for them, you know, perhaps it's some of the similar points that you'd mentioned, but I thought that you brought it up. Maybe I can ask you about people in those careers.
Yeah, so look, barristers are not going away anytime soon. They may do things like this on a screen, but people who argue a case before a judge are not going away soon. If you're a real estate lawyer, that's a repetitive task. And I mean, I don't mean to belittle it, because I think I could lose my job too. My point is, you have to be honest about it. What is the thing? If you're a barrister, then you're kind of like a plumber, right? Or an electrician. It's going to be a while before we will get a robot that can come to my house and fix my light switches, but we don't have, that's a few steps away, right? We've got to accept robotics, and we've got to accept robotics, robots showing up at our house. For the meantime, people who need to deal with plumbing, welding, electrical work, being in front of a courthouse, driving somebody from point to point until we've got automated cars, that's all going to be there. If you're involved in repetitive tasks, no matter how high paying your job is, a computer might be able to do it. And again, I don't know the ins and outs of all of these professions, but I have to assume that if there isn't some creative work involved in what you do, we can get to that easily. We can make computers do all repetitive tasks. So I do think that there's no limit. You should put no limits on that discussion. You should say and look and Google and check and look at Asian countries, which are much, much more accepting of robots in their lives, including in their caregiving for senior citizens and their medical provision. Is somebody allowing robots to do what I do? If nobody's doing it, nobody thinks it's coming up anytime soon, you've got some time to wait. If it is coming, understand how you can fit into that world. And by the way, I just want to use driving it as an example. I think in about 19 states in the United States, driving is the number one profession. Number one. It's a growing profession. Right now, if you wanted to earn a lot of money, becoming a truck driver is actually a really good thing to do, until the day they automate truck driving, which is probably within the next 10 years. And then suddenly, that's going to fall off a cliff. How do you think about that? Maybe if I got 10 years to work, it's a great profession. If I have 50 years to work, driving's probably not a good idea.
Yeah, I sit here in Alberta where people are constantly shocked that the number one job for a male in this province is truck driver, right? So we have those similarities across those borders. When you mention driving, perhaps let me pick up on this thread too, which is the gig economy, right? When we talk about young people coming out of school, when we talk about their future prospects, there's been a couple of things floated to them as part of our new vernacular of work, and there's the gig economy, and then there's this concept of the side hustle, that you do your main thing, but everyone's trying to you're actually got a bigger thing going because you're going to let this other thing on the side just erupt and become your next thing. And part of it's kind of this fetishization of entrepreneurship in some ways, at least how I look at it. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on those two things, and frankly, what your advice to young people would be around both of those, both the gig economy as we see it presented today, and then this concept of the side hustle that has also been kind of put into our zeitgeist.
So this is a great topic because the gig economy and the side hustle sound very empowering, right? I can control my hours. I'm my own boss. It is a little bit of entrepreneurship. The other way to look at this is the gig economy means no full-time work, and the side hustle is your second job. So we have unemployment in the United States before the pandemic. We're not counting the current unemployment because it's all warped. But before the pandemic, we were down to below 4% unemployment in the United States. So many people had two jobs because they needed two jobs because they were earning $7.25 in each of them. You need about $15 an hour to earn a minimum wage in America. So you needed two full-time jobs to earn the same thing that you should be earning to afford your lifestyle. So is that a gig economy? Is that a side hustle, or is that two jobs? So we need to think about this in both ways. The perfect marriage of a gig economy or a side hustle is one in which you have got control over things. You like working at odd hours, so you can be an Uber driver, so you can control when you work, and you like it, and you're earning enough money. But you've seen the wages for drivers continually come down. And then you need healthcare. Now again, this is less of an issue in Canada than it is in the United States, because in the United States, if you take one of these side hustles that doesn't have benefits, you don't get healthcare. You get sick, you got big problems. If you had healthcare like you do in Canada, these things become a little more flexible. So on a lot of levels, I've seen people be able to take jobs that they otherwise couldn't do or couldn't work because of the constraints of their care needs, or their children or parents, or their health needs, or whatever it is, or where what hours their spouse works. So that is very empowering. And side hustles are very empowering. Side hustles can lead to businesses. So I think we have to think about these things as empowering, but we have to be careful about people who use them as excuses to not pay people benefits and to not pay people decent wages. And again, like the last discussion we had about future-proofing, this is an important discussion. There are really good things about these side hustles and these gigs that people can get that they couldn't get in my profession, right? When I graduated, when I was 20, whatever I was, early 20s, if I didn't work for a major newspaper, a radio station, TV station, or a magazine, I didn't work. There was no journalism to be had. Now, everybody I know has a blog or a podcast or something. It's amazing, right? That's a side hustle that actually allows you to participate in your profession. So I think that they can be both good and bad, but people have to get a real handle over what part of it is good for them and what part of it can be abusive to them.
Ali, final thing I wanted to just offer you the floor again. We've covered a lot in this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you want to leave the Jamaat with in this conversation? You've made a lot of poignant points, but is there any sort of headline or any sort of closing thoughts you may have?
Yeah, I have two thoughts about this. One is that we're living through tough times. A lot of them are tougher here in the United States than in Canada because we've got this parallel social justice movement, which has obviously Canada has experienced as well. Canada's in a much better place than the United States is with respect to these social justice issues, but we are all learning about them, right? Me Too is relevant in Canada. Black Lives Matter and the underlying concerns are relevant in Canada. And I think in 20 years, when people say, what did you do in 2020? You want to be able to say you did something. You can change the future of the world right now. And I think we are at this pivotal moment where we shouldn't sit it out. And change is upon us. Point two is that change is upon us. There isn't a better time to start looking at your life, your future, your investments, your diversification, the portfolio that I call your children, and making some decisions. Sometimes life slows down just enough to allow you to look at it properly. For most of the time, it's whizzing around and we're working all the time and you have no time to rethink your life. You're in it. Now you have time to look at it. So look at your life and everything that you can do differently and better, and look at the world. And if that just means changing the life of one other person or making this place a better place, it is part of your ethos. It is part of where you come from. Don't let this opportunity slip by. Make sure that you know by the end of this year that when somebody asks you, what did you do in 2020? You've got a really good answer for them.
Ali, thank you so much for this conversation, your ongoing commentary and analysis, but not just that, for also shaping what we talk about in not just the United States, but in Canada as well. So thank you for that, for injecting your values into those conversations on a daily basis. I know many of us are very, very proud of the work you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate being here a lot.